Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Sorry, yes, thank you.
Thank you. This afternoon, we're going to hear from Miss Branton.
Okay, if you'd like to stand, thank you. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
Declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you please confirm your full name?
Veronica Jane Branton.
And Miss Branton, can you just sit forward a little bit,
Sorry.
just so the microphone picks up your voice? Thank you. And you should have a witness statement in front of you, and that's dated the 4th of September 2024. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And before we begin, I understand there are a couple of amendments you'd like to make to that statement.
Yes, please.
So if we just go to page 22, first of all, and paragraph 69. And I think the amendment should be, once appointed, new NEDs received induction materials, access to, and then the amendment is a number of past board and committee materials. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then page 25 at paragraph 78, the last sentence, you want to add for recommendation to the board. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. So having made those amendments, can I ask you to turn to the final substantive page of your witness statement, which is page 71?
Yes, thank you.
And can you confirm that is your signature?
It is, thank you.
And can you confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you. For the record, that statement is WITN 11420100. Ms. Branton, is there anything that you'd like to say before you start your evidence?
Yes, please. I would just like to say how sorry I am that the actions and inactions of Post Office and others has caused so much suffering to so many sub-postmasters over such a long period of time, and that not all of those individuals have received compensation yet.
Thank you. And could I just ask you just to keep your voice up a little bit? I think you're quite softly spoken. Thank you very much. So, by way of introduction, you were employed by the Post Office from February 2018 to March 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were head of the Secretariat between the 21st of February 2018 and the 31st of May 2019?
That's correct.
You became interim company secretary on the 1st of June 2019 and then company secretary on the 26th of July 2019?
That's correct.
And you remained in that role until about March 2022?
That's correct.
Could I move the microphone closer?
Oh, perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you. We're just going to move the microphone a little bit closer.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So in relation to your professional qualifications, you have an MSc in corporate governance and a practitioner certificate in data protection.
That's right.
And you've been an associate of the Chartered Governance Institute since December 2006.
Yes.
And prior to being employed by the Post Office, you held various administrative and governance roles, and that included as a board secretary and corporation secretary. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And after leaving Post Office in March 2022, you became corporation secretary at Ofcom, where you're still employed. Is that correct?
That's right.
Thank you. So when you were appointed head of Secretariat in February 2018, your line manager was the General Counsel and Company Secretary then, Jane McLeod.
That's right.
And at that point, the role of Company Secretary and General Counsel were held by the same person.
That's right.
Is it right then when Ms McLeod left the Post Office in May 2019, the roles were merged and you took on the Company Secretary, the roles were separated and you took on the Company Secretary role?
That's right, yes.
And what is your understanding of the reason why the roles were separated at that point?
I think to some extent expediency, because there was an immediate gap And I think at that stage, Al Cameron had become the interim chief executive, and he wanted to make sure that there were individuals in those roles quite quickly, and the board was of the same view.
And in Ms McLeod's witness statement, she explains that in your previous role as head of secretariat, you fulfilled the day-to-day responsibilities of the company secretary. Is that a fair description?
That's a fair description.
So how did your role change when you became company secretary?
I think the role changed principally because I had much more direct contact with the board members and with the chair. So previously, a lot had been done through Jane McLeod, whereas when I moved into the role, I was having more conversations directly with board members.
Thank you. And when you became company secretary, did you manage a team, a secretariat team?
I did.
And how many people were in that team?
It ranged over time. So we had some staff shortages at periods. So at one point there were just 2 of us, and at sort of full strength there were 5 of us.
And at what period were there only 2 of you?
Quite soon after I started at Post Office. So there were a couple of people who left very soon after I'd started, and there was already a vacancy. So we had just 2 of us for a few months.
Thank you. So turning then to the training you received when you joined the Post Office.
Yes.
Is it right that you didn't receive any specific briefings or induction on the issues being addressed by this inquiry when you joined the Post Office?
Not that I can recollect.
And did that include issues with the Horizon system?
Yes.
And also the group litigation proceedings which were ongoing at the time you joined the Post Office?
Yes, I didn't receive specific training or induction from recollection, but I was quite soon attending group executive and board meetings to minute those.
And I think that's something you touched on in your statement, that your understanding of the issues addressed by this inquiry came from listening to board and committee meetings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And when you became company secretary, then is it correct you didn't receive any further specific induction or training at that point?
I didn't.
And you explain in your statement that you wouldn't criticise the lack of special induction given the nature of your role. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I think simply that, as you mentioned, I was carrying out a lot of the day-to-day functions as head of secretariat, and so the main change was to have much more direct interaction with board directors at the stage I became company secretary, and obviously had overall accountability when I moved into the company secretary role for running the function and the team.
With hindsight, do you think it would have been helpful to have any specific briefings or induction at the time you became company secretary?
Ideally.
And what would that have involved, ideally?
I think more than anything, it would be understanding whether there were any gaps in my knowledge about what I was expected to fulfil within the role of company secretary versus head of secretariat.
Thank you. So turning then to your role supporting the board specifically, yes. At paragraph 38 of your statement, you explained that you maintained the board forward plan, drafted the agenda and commissioned the papers that were presented to the board.
Yes.
And in terms of the forward plan, can you describe very briefly what that was?
Yes. So the forward plan for board meetings set out all of the cyclical items that were due to go to the board. So there would be a chief executive's report to each board meeting. There would be financial information to each board meeting. There would be a number of things that would come each year, such as the network report, the annual report and accounts, the business plan, and so on. And then there would be the additional items, which would be principally around different areas of different business lines within Post Office, so insurance and post and telecoms.
Thank you. And in terms of the board agenda, is it right that you drafted that with input from both the CEO and also members of the group executive team?
That's correct.
And the final version was approved by the chair of the board?
That's right.
And was that the case in terms of ordinary board meetings and also emergency board meetings?
Yes, certainly for ordinary board meetings. I think for additional board meetings, because they were additional, we wouldn't have had a forward plan of items for those. So yes, I would be seeking advice from others in the business about the content of additional board meeting agendas.
And whose responsibility was it to prioritise particular items of business in the agenda?
Principally the chairman and the chief executive.
And did you have any input into that decision?
Not really.
And when you say not really, is that in respect of particular items you might have had input?
Well, there will have been some governance items that I had produced and included on agendas. And because my team and I were maintaining a forward plan, I wanted to make sure that there weren't items slipping from that forward plan.
But other than that, you didn't have input into the prioritisation of those items?
No.
And once the chairman had approved the agenda, is it correct that you would then circulate that along with the papers for the board?
That's right.
And if there were further updates provided to the board outside meetings, would you expect to have been copied into that correspondence?
I would hope to be.
Could we please have the document with the reference Paul 00103607 on screen? And at the bottom of page 2, please. Thank you. So we can see there that's an email from Alistair Cameron to a number of members of the board on the 28th of June 2019, and you're copied into that email. The subject line is 3 updates, and he starts the email by saying, "Dear board," and if we go over the page, please, to the 3rd update, he says, "Thirdly, we have identified an issue on cash REMs, which creates differences with postmasters. We believe about 120 branches have been affected. We do not yet have a root cause, and that is the IT priority. In addition to contact with affected branches, full communications are going out today to reassure postmasters that we are aware, are resolving individual differences, and there will be no adverse consequences. The GLO team is engaged to ensure we manage this transparently and document it effectively. We've also had rumours of issues with scanning, but have not, I think that should be not identified issues so far." So in respect of those kind of issues, were you expected to take any action when you were copied into emails like that?
Not if I was only copied in and there wasn't a specific request for me to do something.
And did you keep any kind of record of updates provided to the board in this way, so outside meetings?
Not just a general email, no.
And in terms of progressing matters, these kind of updates, whose responsibility was it to ensure that things like this were followed up on?
I think really it would depend who had sent the email in the first place. So had there been a specific action at a board meeting, then it would be for me to make sure that that was followed up on through completion of an action. But where it was an email from, in this instance, Al Cameron to the board, then as he had sent the email and copied me in and not asked me to do anything further, then I would expect him to have followed up on it.
And was that a formal arrangement, or was that just an informal understanding?
I think an informal understanding.
Thank you, that document can come down. So at paragraph 48 of your statement, you explain that the ordinary board packs tended to be lengthy. Was that the case throughout your time working for the post office?
It was the case throughout my time at working at the post office, but it became significantly more so during the period after the judgments had been handed down.
And did you have a role in determining the level of detail in the papers that were presented to the board?
We had, as the Secretariat, my team and I provided guidance on producing papers and a template, but not in terms of any detail. My team and I would have provided support around how to structure papers and how to structure, for example, the recommendation section of a paper where people needed support on that, but not anything on the substance of the recommendation or the content of the paper, because I wouldn't purport, and nobody in the Secretariat would have purported to be subject matter experts.
And at paragraph 50 of your statement, you observed that the level of detail required might vary depending on the trust and confidence felt by individual board members,
Yes.
which could vary over time. Can you explain a bit about what you mean by that?
Yes. So I think that some board directors will naturally be more interested in the detail than others, and so I think quite often your audit and risk committee members will be quite keen on seeing the detail. But I also think more significantly, after the judgments had been handed down, well, I thought of any time after the Common Issues judgment had been handed down, at that stage I think the board's confidence was undermined, and so therefore board members were tending to seek more assurance about the information they received.
And then did that then lead to the board packs and the information going to the board becoming more lengthy?
That was a contributory factor, but I think just the range of issues that the board was considering after the judgments had been handed down.
Could we please have the document with a reference Paul 00393461 on screen, please? And at the bottom of page 1, we can see there's an email from you to the board on the 26th of June 2020, and you've attached draft board minutes. And the email above, directly above that, is a reply from Mr. Cooper, who's the shareholder representative on the board, and he says, I think a number of us are very keen to understand how issues with Horizon, such as the presence of some bugs currently and related process issues, for example, around outstanding dispute and time to resolution, are going to be reported so that we can get comfort that issues are being resolved in a timely way. I don't remember the conversation exactly, but I think there's an action for Julie and the team to come back to us on this, isn't there? Is that an example of a member of the board seeking further assurance from your team? What particular issues?
Yes, I think that's right.
And did you understand who Mr. Cooper was referring to when he said a number of us at the start of that email?
I don't think I could specifically say which board directors that meant, but certainly I would say it was true of non-executive board members.
Thank you. That document can come down. So at paragraph 35 of your statement, you explain that for ordinary board meetings, the papers and the agenda would normally be circulated a week in advance of the meeting. But you go on to explain that when the board started to meet more frequently, it wasn't always possible to send the papers a week in advance. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in writing your statement, you also went back to look at the Post Office's annual report and consolidated financial statements to see how many times the board met each year. And the report records that in 2019 to 2020, the board met 13 times. The next year, that increased to 52. And the year after that, so 2021 to 2022, the board met 33 times. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is that a mixture of ordinary and additional board meetings?
It is, but there was a fairly regular cycle in 2020, 2021, looking at all of the inquiry-related matters. So those meetings tended to take place weekly, whereas the ordinary board meetings tended to take place monthly, with some additional meetings on topics such as funding as well.
And you explained that when the frequency of meetings increased, sometimes papers were only going to the board a day or two in advance. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And could we have a look at UKGI 000043629, please? Thank you. And at the bottom of page 1, please. So we see an email from Mr. Cameron to you on the 18th of November 2020, and that was sent at 18:51 hours. The subject line is board papers on HSS funding for tomorrow, and HSS is it's referred to as the Horizon Shortfall Scheme. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And he says, Veronica, I attached 3 papers for the board tomorrow. Please could you add them to in the following order? So how common was it for papers to be sent to the board the evening before meetings?
I think that was relatively unusual, but it was certainly the case when there were weekly board meetings that papers would only be sent a day or two in advance quite often.
And if we look further up that page, please, we see that Mr. Cameron sends the papers on to a number of individuals at UKGI later, a few minutes after sending it to you. And he says in paragraph 2 of his email, we have worked through all the comments, albeit in a bit of a rush, with some of the team attending the court proceedings. So did you notice any issue with the quality of the papers being submitted whenever this was being done only a day or two in advance? I can't recall specific incidents of that being the case. However, I think that it's unlikely that papers being produced in a rush is going to provide an optimal paper. Thank you. And if we could move then to look at UKGI 000411313, please. And halfway down that page then we can see an email from you on the 19th of May 2021 to a number of members of the board. And you say, dear all, given the papers for tomorrow's meeting were only circulated this morning and there are a lot of important decisions to take, the team has reviewed which decisions might wait, which are urgent and why. Just pausing there, is that the Secretariat team? Or who are you referring to there when you say the team?
Oh, no. The team I'm referring to is Herbert Smith Freehills and also the Historical Matters Business Unit. So they worked in conjunction when it came to looking at items going to the board and the papers going to the board on these matters.
Thank you. And you then go on to say, to this end, item 1 of the decision-making tools has been deferred to next week. And we can see that item 1 below is post-conviction claims. So do we understand from that because the board papers were received so late, decision-making in respect of this particular matter had to be deferred?
Yes, that's how I would read it, yes.
And was that something that was common in your experience?
I think it was common for agendas to move around quite a lot. I would say that one of the challenges, as well as the frequency of meetings at this stage was also that there was information coming from a number of external legal firms, as well as the Historical Matters Business Unit working on things. And so the coordination between those teams and discussions in flight did mean that the decisions sought of that committee were changing quite often.
Thank you. And if we just go down that page slightly, we then see that item 2, again, is the Horizon shortfall scheme. Is that correct?
It is.
So that was, again, something where the papers were going to the board relatively last minute.
Yes.
Thank you. That document can come down. So did anyone raise concerns with you about information relating to important decisions like this going to the board at the last minute?
I certainly think it was a challenge, particularly for non-executive directors, given that they very often had a portfolio of roles and were not full-time at Post Office. But I suspect it began to feel much more full-time than they might have wished. And it's absolutely a challenge for somebody who's not a permanent employee at an organisation to be expected to read quite complex and detailed papers at short notice.
Did anyone specifically raise concerns with you?
I think that concerns were raised periodically at those meetings and at board meetings about the amount of information that directors were expected to process and assimilate quickly.
And do you think that this was inevitable given the position that Post Office found itself in at the time, or could anything have been done to handle the situation better?
I think there was probably a tension between wanting to progress matters quickly and giving people enough time to thoroughly assess the recommendations.
And do you think that anything could have been done to assist with that?
I think probably the coordination between the internal team and the external legal firms might have been better, because I think sometimes the external legal teams wanted to get matters into a particular board meeting to get a decision, and that sometimes meant that papers were later than one would have wished.
And when you say external legal teams, who are you referring to in particular?
Principally Herbert Smith Freehills, but Peters and Peters was also involved.
And in terms of the resulting impact on your secretariat team, at paragraph 91 of your statement, you say that time had to be spent dealing with new problems as they arose. Post Office executives were working at full stretch, and the volumes of meetings and the governance support required meant that my team and I were at times struggling to keep up. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at what point did you start thinking that your team was struggling to keep up?
I think it took me longer than it should have done, but I don't think I was initially aware that the volume of meetings was going to be sustained over such a long period of time. And I also, having not been in any situation like it before, I didn't really recognise for some while that it was a company in complete crisis. But, you know, I think probably I should have realised earlier, but I didn't really appreciate, and probably until 2021, that it was really unsustainable.
And so at that point, then you realised the need for additional resource in your team, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you also go on to explain in your statement that by that point, it was difficult to attract and retain new governance professionals in your team.
It was.
And why do you say that?
I think probably a combination of things. I think that Post Office's reputation was obviously severely damaged. It also happened to coincide with a spike in demand for mid-level company secretaries. And I also, you know, in good conscience, when interviewing people, I couldn't do anything other than say that it was a difficult situation. It wouldn't have been fair not to advise people of that. And had I not done so, I don't think people would have stayed anyway. So that probably excluded some candidates from wanting to join as well.
And at paragraph 97 of your statement, you also say that you characterise it in the following way. You say that one of the reasons was that the post office was a pressure cooker, in your words, at that point. And can you explain what you mean by that?
I think that the organisation couldn't cope with the volume of work across a wide range of issues. I think the senior leadership of the post office was primarily private sector and had skills and experience in business, but was much less well served to be able to deal with all of the matters that the inquiry is dealing with, and also because of the very poor image of the organisation and the need to provide additional assurance to a whole range of stakeholders. That was driving additional work through things like increases in freedom of information requests. So across the piece, and needing to pivot from all of the matters that are being addressed by the inquiry and running the business of today, attempting to change the culture of the organisation, I don't think there was the bandwidth or the resource. And then the organisation also had severe funding challenges, which then meant it couldn't invest in what it needed to support postmasters better.
Thank you. So turning then to a new topic, which is meeting minutes.
Yes.
And from mid-2020, is it right that you were attending and minuting the majority of group executive, board and committee meetings?
That's correct.
And you explain in your statement that you moved to a fuller style of minutes in general when you became company secretary.
That's correct.
And why was that?
I thought that given everything that had happened with the group litigation, there would be far more focus on the organisation and a need for individual directors to be able to demonstrate challenge. And so I thought it was important to be able to show who was saying what and what information they were asking for.
And in terms of the attribution of particular points to particular people, you explain in your statement that you had raised the issue with the chairman at the time, Mr. Parker. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And when was that?
That was probably at some point in 2020.
And can you explain the nature of the conversation that you had with him?
I think it was a fairly brief one, which was explaining, I think, what I've just mentioned about the importance of being able to show where individual directors had made particular points given the situation.
So was it a conversation initiated by you or by Mr. Parker?
By me.
So I want to turn to a specific issue with meeting minutes that you address quite fully in your statement, and that concerns the bonus scheme, which is called the Transformation Incentive Scheme.
Yes.
So after leaving the post office, you became aware that this scheme was the subject of an independent review by the Department of Business and Trade. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So could we please have RLIT 40337, thank you very much, on screen? We can see that this is a review that was conducted by the law firm Simmons & Simmons, and it concerned a review of the governance relevant to Post Office Limited senior executive remuneration in August 2023. And if we could turn to page 3 of that document, please. And starting at paragraph 1.2, explains that the background to our review is that on the 1st of March 2023, the Post Office published its annual report and accounts for the financial year 21-22, containing the Post Office Director's remuneration report. Going down to paragraph 1.4, The annual report and accounts included a summary table setting out the performance assessment for the inquiry metric and its sub-metrics. The relevant sub-metric for the purpose of our review is known as the inquiry support target. In relevant part, the summary table reads as follows, and the metric is set out at the bottom of that table, and under target it says all evidence required and information supplied on time with confirmation from Sir Wyn Williams and team that Post Office's performance supported and enabled the inquiry to finish in line with expectations, and it's marked as having been achieved. So this review then focused on the decision making which led to this metric being marked as achieved in summary. So if we could move to page 23 of this report, please. But halfway down the page, thank you. The header there was REMCO, that's the Remuneration Committee, decision that the inquiry metric had been achieved and that bonuses should be awarded in accordance with it justifiable. And at paragraph 3.62, it states, it's important to note that because of the poor standard of REMCO minutes, it's not clear precisely what decision the REMCO took at the relevant REMCO meetings held on the 25th of January 2022 and the 22nd of February 2022. Further, the recollections of those involved are sufficiently different that we cannot be certain that those attending those meetings were clear about how the REMCO in fact read the second limb of the inquiry support target, though there is evidence to support a conclusion that REMCO took the first reading. Is it correct then that you took the minutes at the meeting on the 25th of January 2022?
That's correct.
And another member of your team took the minutes at the meeting on the 22nd of February 2022?
That's correct.
And you left the business then shortly thereafter?
Yes.
So you weren't interviewed as part of this review, is that correct?
That's correct.
So going then to paragraph 3.64, in terms of our review, this governance weakness has meant that it's been extremely challenging to reach a firm conclusion about the basis for REMCO's decisions and therefore to determine whether those decisions were justifiable. There's an excerpt then from the meeting minutes, if we go to page 51. And that's the excerpt from the meeting that you minuted,
Yes.
which says, Tom Cooper asked how we would evidence that we were meeting the requirements of the public inquiry. Nick Reid said that we could provide the positive feedback we'd received from the inquiry team on the disclosures we had made. AW, I think that's Angela Williams, added that the Post Office team could evidence that the disclosure requests had been met and the timings of these. Then Tidswell noted that the appendix to the inquiry paper in the board pack provided some helpful detail about our interactions with the inquiry team. And finally, paragraph 7.44, it says, it seems likely that Tom Cooper's sensible question would have been raised in the context of a broader discussion about the inquiry support target. However, this limited record of that discussion does not take us any further in understanding how the inquiry support target was read by REMCO. So at paragraph 225 of your statement, you explain that you don't think the committee was being asked to take a decision in this meeting. Can you explain a bit about why you think that's the case?
Yes, of course. So this was an additional Remuneration Committee meeting, and the committee at that meeting was receiving an update rather than being asked to take any decisions.
And is that then the reason why we don't see any decision reflected in the minutes?
That's correct.
And what is your response to the criticisms made earlier in that review that the governance framework was inadequate and the meeting minutes were of a poor standard?
I think that, generally speaking, the minutes were of an adequate standard, and that Remuneration Committee members had a chance to comment on those drafts.
And is it the case that after you drafted those minutes, you circulated them to the committee and they were approved by the committee?
They were.
And that document can come down. Thank you. So it's your response that you think that those meeting minutes are adequate?
I completely accept that the minutes of both meetings have been deemed to be inadequate, and that the minutes of the meeting that discussed and approved the bonus scheme payments didn't record the information that was required to make it clear why the decision had been taken to apply discretion and to approve the sub-metric on providing information to the inquiry.
Is it your view that the decision was actually reached in the February meeting rather than in the meeting that you minuted?
Yes, because the January meeting, the committee wasn't being asked to take a decision, it was receiving an update.
Thank you. And you go on to explain at paragraph 230 of your statement that on occasion decisions of the Remuneration Committee were sought and obtained outside meetings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in those circumstances, sometimes the Secretariat team weren't aware that the decision had been taken?
That's correct.
Could we please have Paul 00448778 on screen, please? And halfway down page 1, please, we can see an email from Angela Williams to you on the 25th of June 2021, and the subject is Remuneration Committee, 1st of July 2021. She says, thanks for this, please see comments below. So if we go over the page, please. And at the paragraph starting 3A, it says approval of the transformation incentive scheme metrics. This refers to approval by email for postmaster satisfaction metric, which I don't think I've seen. The paper refers to the shareholder approval being required for the CEO, but I think this should be for the CFO as well. And in red then is Ms. Williams' response to your question. I've received Tim, Lisa and Ken's approvals, but still awaiting Tom. I will chase again on Monday. Agree it would apply to everyone, and then we need to do a separate approval letter / paper for Nick, and we'll also reference Al, but he should be included as a GE member under this approval anyway. And if we go then to the top of page 1, please, which is your response. You email Ms. Williams and say, with approvals, it would be better if they came from COSEC. Is that the company secretary?
Yes, thank you.
So that we have a clear company record and audit trail. In brackets, not being precious, it's just that record keeping has been a bit of an issue and people always come back to COSEC when looking for decisions. Is that an example of a decision being made without your team being made aware?
It is.
And at paragraph 230 of your statement, you say, I'm not suggesting this was deliberate, more indicative of a lack of continuity and thereby understanding of the required governance. Can you help us with what you mean by that? Yes.
There had been a very high turnover of chief people officers. I was at Post Office for 4 years, and in that time there were 5 chief people officers. And I think the absence of continuity certainly had an impact on remuneration committee issues.
So do we take from that it was, you're suggesting that the chief people officer maybe didn't know that you should be looped in on all of these decisions being taken?
I think that's right.
And was this a common occurrence?
I think that it was more difficult with remuneration issues than anything else because of the requirements for shareholder approval. And I think that meant that there were more discussions outside of meetings and not going through formal governance than would otherwise be the case. And part of the issue was that there was an open timeline for obtaining approval. So I think if you'd been able to say that you could get an approval within a few weeks, that might have been one thing. But there were some instances where approvals were sought but not obtained for the best part of a year.
And in that email, you refer to the fact that record keeping has been a bit of an issue. Are you referring there to the Remuneration Committee specifically, or a wider issue?
I was thinking specifically about remuneration issues.
And do you remember any conversation following you raising this concern with Ms Williams?
No, but I think that Angela had responded to my email and was supportive of making sure that my team were looped in future.
And did that in fact happen? Did you see a change?
I wasn't aware of formal decisions not coming through through myself and my team, but I would say that it was still the case that there were quite a lot of conversations outside of Remuneration Committee meetings, principally because of, as I say, needing to obtain shareholder approval. And so the chair of the Remuneration Committee, the chairman, and the shareholder representative would quite often have separate conversations.
And how did you become aware that those conversations were taking place without your knowledge?
Well, usually because when we got to a formal governance point through a Remuneration Committee meeting, the position would sometimes have moved on from the previous meeting, and it was clear from some of the papers coming through that that had been on the back of the conversations taking place outside of meetings.
Did you raise that as a separate concern, that you weren't aware of these conversations going on outside the meetings?
I didn't, because I thought it was the nature of the beast, as it were, because of requiring shareholder approval, and therefore, and as I mentioned, the approval could take a long period of time. So it wasn't going to be the case that there was a Remuneration Committee meeting convened necessarily to have a sort of sub-conversation to progress an existing matter.
Thank you. Could we have Paul 00104112 on screen, please? Thank you. And at page 3, please. And we see an email from Mr. Cooper to you and a number of others, but it's addressed to you on the 22nd of April 2020. And he says, I've got a few points on the minutes from the last meeting. Given the people that received this email, do we take from that as a board meeting that he's talking about?
Yes.
And he then goes on to say, in the matters resolved in paragraph 7, it mentions a route map of decisions leading to the GLO and makes specific reference to who knew about the Deloitte report. I'd like to clarify the who knew about question should apply to the various pieces of work commissioned, one following the Post Office response to the second site report, 2 following termination of the mediation scheme, and 3 following the Jonathan Swift QC report. He goes on to say, although not discussed explicitly last week, I hope we can agree also to look at whether recommended actions, for example by the QCs, were not completed or only partially completed. A good example is the Deloitte report, which, as I understand it, only addressed the Horizon system since 2010, notwithstanding the QC's recommendation to look at remote access over the life of the Horizon system. So is this Mr. Cooper asking for greater clarity in the minutes of the board meeting?
Yes, I would read it as such. I think what Tom Cooper was saying was that he was providing the Deloitte report and who knew about that when as an example of what information was known by the board, by whom and when, but that actually he wanted to extend that to all of the issues that were going to the board or not going to the board.
Thank you. So if we go to the email above then, please. And you reply saying, thanks, Tom, I'll make those changes. And then the next email above. and that's an email from Carla Stent on the 23rd of April 2020. She says 2 further comments from me on reading the minutes and provides 2 items, and then points out that there's a typo in one of the appendices. If we go to the email above then from you, you send that email on to Mr. Parker on the 23rd of April 2020, and you say, please find attached the revised minutes with track changes. So is this a kind of typical example of when you sent the draft board minutes and people then coming back to you with suggestions for further input?
Yes.
And when you read that exchange, is that indicative of your initial draft minutes being inadequate, or is it the case that people are seeking further assurance, as you explained previously?
I would expect it in the normal course of producing minutes to ask people directors attending the meeting to provide comments on those minutes. That I would just see as a normal way to do things.
Thank you. And just finally, if we looked at the email above. Thank you. And we see that that's an email from Mr. Parker, and he says, I'm okay with the revised minute. So would that then be the point where that would then be approved as the formal minute of that meeting?
That would be the final draft, but the final draft would then go into the next meeting pack for approval at the subsequent meeting.
Thank you. So that can come down then, please. So turning then to the topic of governance reporting.
Yes.
So is it correct that the Post Office reported on its governance processes annually in the governance report?
That's correct.
And that report addressed the findings of board and committee effectiveness reviews?
That's correct.
And can you explain briefly what those reviews entailed, please?
Yes. So Post Office would carry out a board and committee effectiveness review each year, and typically there would be an externally facilitated review every 3rd year, which is in accordance with best practice under the UK Corporate Governance Code. For the internally facilitated review, I would work with the Senior Independent Director, take proposals for a questionnaire to the Nominations Committee for approval. I would then send out the questionnaire, collate the responses, draft a report and share that initially with the Senior Independent Director for review, and then the report would be sent to the board, and the board would discuss that and then subsequently would discuss and agree recommendations arising from that review. With the externally facilitated review, the Nominations Committee made a selection of external providers tendering, and they would conduct that review. That would be more comprehensive than an internal review because it would include interviews with all of the board members and a number of additional senior executives.
And in terms of the external review then, was your role to provide feedback from that review to the board?
The external facilitator would provide that feedback.
And did you then follow up on which recommendations from those reviews should be taken forward?
That's right.
And keep track of whether they'd in fact been achieved?
That's correct.
Could we please have your witness statement on screen at WITN 11420100? Thank you very much. And at paragraph 89, beg your pardon, you explain, in my opinion, the formal governance arrangements at the time I left the Post Office were, as a matter of general principle, adequate, but were no longer effective to deal with the issues which had arisen. So just pausing there, some people might think that's a contradiction in terms that something could be adequate but ineffective. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I think that the governance framework was adequate, but I think that because of the pressure that the organisation was under and beginning to be able to not able to deliver across the range of issues it was having to deal with. It would have been better to step back and see whether we needed to change any of the governance arrangements. And I'm thinking in particular about the very high volume of meetings, the pressure that put on non-executive directors, and also that I think that the nature of decisions can change in a time of crisis, particularly where you're needing to seek a lot of, where you're being asked to provide a lot of additional assurance because of the low level of trust that the shareholder had in the board and the board had to some extent in the executive.
And you go on to explain that the volume of meetings and the range of decisions the board was required to take to address the findings of the judgments and all that flowed from this, while trying to oversee the running of the business in precarious financial circumstances, and with some of the senior relationships starting to break down, in particular the CEO Nick Reid and the CFO Alistair Cameron, meant the demands on board time were, in my opinion, in excess of what would generally be regarded as sustainable. So how long do you think the board have been trying to operate at a level which was unsustainable by the time that you left the post office?
I think that from probably the spring of 2020, when the CCRC had referred cases to the Court of Appeal Criminal Division, and when the board had decided that it needed to be responsible for reviewing all of the inquiry-related matters because they were too important to be dealt with by a subcommittee of the board alone, that was probably the point at which it began to be far in excess of the hours set out in people's appointment letters.
And in relation to your reference there to the breakdown between Nick Reid and Mr. Cameron, how do you think that impacted the board's work?
Well, I think it's never helpful to have strained relationships within the top team, and it diverts attention away from the matters an organisation should be focusing on to other matters.
And did you observe the breakdown of any other senior relationships in your time working for the post office?
Not that I would call out.
Thank you, that can come down. So paragraph 210 of your witness statement, you also explained that the governance structure at the post office is made more complex by having a shareholder representative on the board who is not in fact from the shareholder. Can you help us with what you mean by that?
Yeah. I would say that had Post Office only been dealing with running Post Office and developing Post Office, then having a shareholder representative from UKGI would have made absolute sense, because the UKGI executive directors come from a business background, and so arguably they're better placed to be able to provide oversight of the operation of a commercial business. But actually, once you got into the stage of post the judgments being handed down, you were dealing with needing to obtain funding from government, needing to understand how government operated, and also there were lots of sensitivities around things like remuneration, which I think somebody from a purely private sector background is less attuned to than somebody who is experienced in working in the public sector. And so having a shareholder representative directly from the shareholder, in my opinion, would have made more sense at that time.
Thank you. And you've already alluded to it, but at paragraph 92 of your statement, you said that reflecting on things, more consideration should have been given to how to manage governance arrangements during a period of crisis for the company. Could we have a look at Paul 00448723, please? And this is one of the effectiveness reviews, the externally facilitated one that you referred to earlier. And it is from March 2021. And if we could go to page 4 of that report, please. And looking at paragraph 8. it says that boards typically need actively to shift on a board governance spectrum at times of crisis, being close to the operational detail and then moving back to a more normal position of strategic oversight. As the Post Office Board starts to emerge from a time of intense work on the historical litigation and looks ahead to shaping a positive future for the business, it will want to move back to a position where its focus is less operational and more on strategic oversight. This move needs to be underpinned by grounded trust and evidence-based confidence that the organisation is fully under control. The main theme of this report could therefore be called Moving Along the Strategic Operational Spectrum, considering how the board can plan and best equip itself to make this move when it becomes possible. So is this what you mean when you refer to reflecting on what it means to govern a company in a time of crisis?
Not specifically that point, because I think that by the time I left Post Office in March 2022, it was still very much in a period of crisis, and therefore the non-executives were more closely involved than might normally be the case. I think the things I was thinking of were to do with looking at things like how you allocated resource when, because of the different demands on the company, you quite often needed to pivot resource from one matter to another, and you needed to be able to have flexible resource. And I think at the time there was a lot of activity going on, a lot of looking at, for example, how to address the findings from the judgments, a lot of activity in terms of how do we better support postmasters, how do we change our culture, how do we engage more. But I don't think there was an overarching crisis management plan, and actually I think that's probably what was needed for governance, but for other matters as well.
And whose responsibility would it have been to formulate and propose that overarching strategy plan?
I think principally the chief executive.
And do you think that's something that, from a governance perspective, you should have raised at the time?
Had I reflected at that time and understood at that time that it was a sustained period of crisis and how that might impact on decision making, yes, but unfortunately I didn't.
So the final topic I want to address is the culture in the post office during your time working there. So at paragraph 215 of your statement, you explain that when you joined Post Office, the board's focus was on the defence of the GLO proceedings rather than the experience of those involved in it. Is that correct?
I believe so.
And is that something that you thought of at the time, or is that something that you've thought about reflecting on?
That's with the benefit of hindsight and understanding now what actually happened.
And you described there being a period of shock following the handing down of the Common Issues judgment in March 2019. And how did that manifest? Like, what did you see that led you to conclude that the business was in a period of shock?
I think that there was, I think people will be well aware that there was a period following the Common Issues judgment being handed down where Post Office sought to asked for the judge to recuse himself. And so I believe it took some while for the board to actually fully understand and absorb the fact that the approach taken to the group litigation had been entirely wrong in substance and in tone. But I think that by the end of 2019, when the Horizon Issues judgment was handed down, the board members had actually realised that they had followed the completely wrong approach to the litigation.
And at paragraph 109 of your statement, you explain that following those judgments being handed down at board level, there seemed to you to be a desire to lead and drive cultural change. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you notice that across the board or in relation to particular members of the board?
Across the board.
Can we have your witness statement back on screen, please? WITN 11420100 at page 43. And there, at paragraph 132, you say that I recall sometimes work to make the post office more postmaster-centric, unearth additional problems, which to me demonstrated the scale of the cultural challenge. So pausing there, whenever you were talking about the desire for cultural change, was making the business more postmaster-centric the driving force behind that?
I believe so.
But you explain there, I recall that when SPMs were asked about their experience of the branch support centre, that was one of the initiatives set up after the judgments.
No, it was an existing support centre, but postmasters had been asked for their views about how it was operating in practice, and there was a senior leadership group session where 3 postmasters came to explain how they found support or lack of support from Post Office.
And did you attend that meeting?
I did.
And you explained their responses revealed that not only was it often not easy to get queries resolved, but also that the tone and attitude of those working in the branch support centre were considered an issue. So can you provide any specific examples of when tone and attitude were raised as an issue?
One of the postmasters who'd attended that meeting explained where he had called the support centre and hadn't been able to resolve an issue and had to call back again, rather than somebody saying, well, we're very sorry that we haven't managed to sort out your query first time round. It was more of a, oh, it's you again sort of response.
And when were these issues? Did that meeting take place?
This will have been in 2020 or perhaps early 21.
Thank you. That can come down. So you also point to the appointment of the sub-postmaster non-executive directors as another cultural shift. And why did you think that represented another shift in the business?
Because I think it was bringing postmasters into the top-tier decision-making forum of the company and able to influence the strategic direction of the company.
And did you have a role in the onboarding process for Mr. Ismail and Mr. Jacobs?
I did.
And can you explain what your role was in that process?
Yes. It was to help with the induction process. The induction process was, supported by a number of people, but when it came to providing induction materials, that fell mainly to me.
And was that actually drafting the induction materials or collating them?
Well, we had a standard bundle when it came to core documents such as the Articles of Association and so on. But when it came to producing the briefing note, I produced that with input from others.
And what issues were on your mind when you were drafting that might be particular to SPM NEDs who were joining the board as opposed to other board members?
I don't think I thought of anything particularly in terms of the briefing note, because the briefing note was to set out the main topics that the board was considering at that time and then providing papers that linked to those main topics. I think in thinking about sub-postmasters joining the board, the things I was thinking about was the time commitment, given the state of crisis the company was in and the very high volume of board meetings that were being held. The fact that most of the non-executives had a portfolio of non-executive roles, whereas Saf Ishmael and Elliot Jacobs were running post offices and retail businesses, so the time commitment was going to be harder for them than the other non-executives. The non-executives on the post office board, I think, had said to a person that it was the most challenging non-executive role they had. So it was things like that that I was thinking about when they were joining the board.
Thank you. Could we have on screen, please, Paul 00448777? And page 2, please. And if we could go down that page, please. Thank you. So that is, at the bottom of that page, is an email from you on the 28th of January 2021 to Mr. Parker. And if we go to the second paragraph of that email, which is over the page. And you explain there are a number of governance issues I've flagged. We already breached the UK Corporate Governance Code as Tom sits on REMCO and ARC, but isn't an independent NED. And if the PM NEDs, that's the sub-postmaster NEDs, were to join committees, we'd exacerbate that issue. We will, in any case, no longer have a majority of independent NEDs on the board. Can you explain that issue that you're raising there, please?
Yes, so under the UK Corporate Governance Code, the subcommittees of boards are meant only to have a membership of independent non-executive directors. And the reason for that is that not being independent is seen as one factor that can impair the objectivity of your decision making.
And you go on to say, as you know, explaining rather than complying is always an option. And to be honest, it's less the independence issue that I'm concerned about than it being overwhelming if the new appointees have no prior board experience, are trying to do a full-time day job and have a substantial induction programme to cover. So there are the new appointees that you're referring to are the sub-postmaster NEDs.
That's right.
And just to break that sentence down, when you say explaining rather than complying is always an option, do you mean that you can explain a breach of the UK Governance Code?
Yes, the UK Governance Code allows companies to explain why they're not following a particular provision where there's a good reason not to do so.
And at that point, given that there was already a breach because Mr. Cooper sat on REMCO and ARC, had the Post Office in fact explained that breach of the governance code?
In its governance report, in the annual report and accounts, I believe it did. And
you explain it's less the independence issue rather that it might be overwhelming if the SPM NEDs were to sit on board committees. So is your primary concern it being too much information too quickly for the SPM NEDs?
Yes, given the situation the company was in at the time. But I do say elsewhere, I believe, that my suggestion was that the new postmaster NEDs, and we didn't know, I believe, at this time, who the new postmaster NEDs were going to be, and therefore whether they had prior board experience or not. But my subsequent suggestion was that the postmaster NEDs attended one of each of the committee meetings to get a feel for how they operated, but that there was a pause for a few months on considering whether to appoint them to committees so that they had time essentially to get their feet under the table.
And when you say it's less the independence issue that I'm concerned about, was that because, in your view, Post Office could just explain the situation?
Yes, and there'd been a very valid reason for the shareholder representative being on those committees, so there would equally have been an argument for the postmaster NEDs to join those committees.
Thank you. That document can come down. Mr. Jacobs gave evidence to the inquiry last week, and he explained in his evidence that the Post Office, in his view, underestimated the need to train the new SPM NEDs properly and described the training as intense but limited. Did either of the SPM NEDs raise concerns with you at the time?
They didn't at the time, but then I think you have to set that in the context of Saf and Elliot having been through quite an intensive induction programme and my leaving post office within 10 months of them starting. So they probably hadn't at that stage really, if anything, recovered from the initial induction programme.
And you explained that by the time you left the post office, your view was that they were full and valued participants at board meetings and their contributions were valued.
That was what I felt from my observation of those meetings, and the fact that they were, looking back at the minutes, they were contributing across all of the topics raised at board.
And the inquiry is familiar with the Times article dated the 19th of February 2024, and I think you've also seen a copy of that article.
I have.
And in that article, Mr. Jacobs is reported to have said that the culture is still exists, that postmasters are guilty and on the take, and that him and Mr. Ismail continue to be ignored and seen by many as an annoyance. Is that something you observed?
Not at board level, and I think my primary contact with Saf and Elliot was at board meetings and around board meetings.
And when you say not at board level, did you observe it in other areas of the business?
Not that I came into contact with, no.
And did you receive any reports of that kind of feeling in different areas of the business? No,
though I think, as I've mentioned in my witness statement, there were clearly still cultural issues. I've mentioned the help centre not being helpful.
Thank you. So, despite observing a desire for a cultural change at board level, you explained that there are a number of things that pointed the opposite direction. In your witness statement, you provide the example of a colleague survey in March 2022, which returned poor results. And what's your recollection of that survey?
My recollection of that survey and the results was that the position hadn't materially improved from when McKinsey had carried out an organisational health index, and that the results of that were that it placed Post Office in the lowest quartile when it came to their benchmark of results, and that one of the things that stood out particularly was low levels of trust across the organisation, but including within the senior leadership group.
Thank you. And just finally, then, if we could look back to your witness statement, WITN 11420100 at page 40. And at paragraph 123, thank you, you say, ultimately, though, by the time I left in March 2022, I thought that the post office reputation might have been damaged beyond the point of repair, and that the huge challenges for the business going forward, as well as addressing the issues of the past, while in a precarious financial position, might have made the changes needed culturally and otherwise undeliverable. So why do you say there that you think the post office's reputation might have been damaged beyond the point of repair?
Because I think those low levels of trust permeated throughout the organisation, the view of the shareholder of Post Office, and in the outside world.
Thank you, Ms. Branton. Those are all the questions I have for you. Sir, can I just check, first of all, if you have any questions for Ms. Branton?
No, thank you, no.
And I'll just turn to core participants. Yes. Sir, Mr. Steen has 2 minutes worth of questions, so I think that'd be fine without having a break. But I go to the stenographer to, yes, I think that we have agreement from the shorthand writer.
All right, Mr. Steen, you've limited yourself very strictly. Over.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Branton, my name is Sam Steen. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters and people that worked in branches as well. The topic I want to ask you about is about the other handover, the handover to the witness that we had earlier today. That's Ms. Scaraballotti, okay, because she took over from your role.
She did.
You've just been speaking to Ms. Miller about the fact of other people coming on board at the post office, yes, and about the induction process and the like. So I just want to ask you about her induction process and what she knew about it. Paragraph 124 of your statement which is a paragraph after the one Ms. Miller looked at. You're referring there to people who are joining potentially an organisation in crisis may want to because it's a challenge, because they want to be part of turning it around. And in the paragraph Ms. Miller was pointing to, you say there that there were lots of difficulties and you weren't certain it could survive the post office. So, with that rather long introduction, minute 2 now, did you tell Ms. Caraballotti that, look, this place is in crisis, really not sure it's heading for a great future? Did you give her that as a basic part of her induction?
I don't think I would have put it as baldly as that.
No.
I think I will have explained the great pressures the organisation was under.
Because there's a 10-page note that you left her, and if I don't have the time within my self-imposed 2 minutes, but you remember it perhaps, it certainly doesn't convey a sense of crisis. It does talk about the challenges in having meetings, and there's lots of meetings.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say the word crisis or anything close to that. Why not?
I'd probably be more likely to talk to somebody about that than put it in a note.
And did you, though? That's the question.
Did I? I think I probably talked about the pressure of work rather than talking about. I don't think I will have said that the organisation was in a state of crisis. And I think some of my understanding of the organisation being in a state of crisis is having stepped back from being in that pressure cooker environment and really fully understanding that.
And so really, in the last dying seconds, if I've probably trespassed over my 2 minutes, one of the things, you were there for about 4 years, since 2018. You
Yes.
lived through the High Court litigation, the Court of Appeal case, the start of this inquiry and so on.
Yes,
So you kind of saw it all at that stage.
yes,
And I think you recognised trying to find people that can take on these pressures, these difficulties, it's really problematic.
it is.
Thank you, Ms. Branton.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Steen. That's it, is it, Ms. Miller?
It is. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Branton, for coming to give evidence and for providing a witness statement. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think we're back Tuesday next week.
10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, everyone.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye.